Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. King Edward IV was a man who came out a victor of one of the most complex political situations ever recorded. The Wars of the Roses was a series of civil wars fought between two families for the right to sit on the English throne. Its complexity, its backstabbing, its never-ending twists would go on to inspire George R.R. Martin to write his series Game of Thrones. We'll talk about the wars, their many characters, and just how Edward IV found himself the victor of the real Game of Thrones. At the end, we'll also reveal recreations of Edward and his wife of legendary beauty, Elizabeth Woodville. So let's go ahead and get started. Edward, the Earl of March, was born on April 28, 1442, to his father, Richard, the 3rd Duke of York, a commander of English troops in France. Born in the midst of the 100 Years' War, Edward's home country of England was struggling economically and suffering defeat after defeat to France. The tension amongst the English people was palpable. Their king was weak and corrupt, and the nobility began to secretly look to other places for a leader. Edward's father, Richard of York, was where they found their solution. But in order to truly understand Edward's story, we must go back nearly 70 years before he was born, to the 1370s, where the tension truly began. King Edward III was a well-respected and admired king of England, who turned England into a military power and spent most of his life expanding England into France, starting the legendary 100 Years' War. His eldest son and heir, Edward, the Black Prince, was also well-liked. But in 1376, the Black Prince suddenly died. Now, because King Edward III had 2 living sons left, nobody could have imagined that this would cause any real problems. The throne would simply be passed on to his eldest living son, John of Gaunt. But when King Edward III did pass away, he shocked everyone by skipping his living sons, instead opting for the son of the late Black Prince, a 10-year-old boy who would be crowned King Richard II. Edward III's eldest living child, John of Gaunt, was the Duke of Lancaster, and his descendants would come to be known as the Lancastrians, represented by a red rose. Edward III's second living eldest son, Edmund of Langley, was the Duke of York. The Yorks would come to be represented by a white rose. King Edward's decision to skip these 2 powerful sons in the line of succession is what truly changed the course of English history, eventually leading to a civil war between the 2 families. The young King Richard II's reign was marked by unrest. His uncle, John of Gaunt, essentially stepped in to rule in his stead, becoming extremely rich and powerful. John was successfully able to keep the peace, no small feat considering the nobility hated Richard II. When John died in 1399, there was no one left to hold this fragile peace together. Richard II would immediately exile John of Gaunt's son Henry and take all of his father's massive wealth and titles away from him. For the next 2 years, Richard would execute nobles that had revolted against him, attempting to consolidate his power against the hostile nobility. But this tyranny of Richard II would instead backfire, fueling propaganda and turning the people against their king. John's exiled son Henry rose up against Richard, invading England, marching into London virtually unopposed, and eventually winning the crown as Henry IV. A Lancaster now sat on the throne. Despite minor unrest, King Henry IV was able to keep the crown until his death in 1413, when he was succeeded by his son Henry V. Known as one of England's greatest warrior kings, Henry V's victory at the Battle of Agincourt would cause the French to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which stated that Henry V was now the heir to the French and English throne, effectively ending the 100 Years' War. Yet all of this nearly didn't happen. Right before the decisive Battle of Agincourt, a plot to depose King Henry V was found out. Its ringleader was a man named Richard of Königsberg, a cousin of Henry V and a York are first evidence of a conflict directly between the two houses. Henry V executed the man without mercy, but more important to the story, the man's 4-year-old son was allowed to keep his dukedom. The boy would grow up to become the Lancaster family's worst enemy, becoming Richard, the 3rd Duke of York. What looked as if it was going to be a long and glorious reign ended abruptly when King Henry V died in 1422 at only the age of 35. His son, the new King of England and France, was only 9 months old. King Henry VI was coddled and taken advantage of by countless power-hungry men since the day of his birth. He would grow up to be pacifist, fickle, and extremely reliant on the advice of others, making him ill-fit for the time he lived in. His childhood was marked by England's failure to keep the gains that his father Henry V had made in France, allowing the French to rally around Joan of Arc, regaining their morale and crowning their own king. By 1436, Henry VI was beginning to wonder if the war in France was even worth it. Nearly all of his advisors, including Richard of York, who had risen from his father's shame to become a commander of English troops in France, agreed that all they needed was a full commitment of resources to take the fight to the French. Yet despite overwhelming advice, it only took one man, named William de la Pole, to convince Henry that diplomacy was the only way forward. Henry would send de la Pole to France, where he eventually negotiated an effort of peace through the royal marriage of King Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. Margaret would become one of the most, if not the most influential person of this time. She was incredibly ambitious, and she quickly became the power and the engine behind King Henry VI's crown, influencing every decision Henry made for the rest of his life, including who he chose for powerful positions, who he gave land and money to, and who he surrounded himself with. But the people of England saw right through this corruption of the king by the new French queen. The people revolted against King Henry and his wife. It was during this time of revolt and growing instability that the boy who would become Edward IV was born, and his father Richard of York's rise to power began. Although Richard had served King Henry faithfully his entire life, he found himself on Margaret's bad side, after becoming enemies with her closest ally Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset. She would send Richard away to Ireland, ending his influence on the king entirely. But the revolts against the crown gave Richard the perfect opportunity to make his concerns about Margaret known. He would return to London and stand with the people, who had begun to look at Richard as the leader they needed. His York claim to the throne was looking more and more appealing. With King Henry's rule deteriorating, Richard of York made a daring bid for power. Since Henry and Margaret did not have an heir after 7 years of marriage, Richard asked to be recognized as heir to the English throne. The move would immediately backfire, resulting in York's imprisonment, which he was only released from after swearing an oath of allegiance to the king. Although the revolts would not die down, support for Richard waned. All seemed lost for the York family until 1453, when England suffered its most catastrophic defeat to the French at the Battle of Castillon. The battle drove the English completely out of France and effectively ended the 100 Years' War in a disgraceful defeat. The furious people of England would blame Henry VI for it all. He would suffer a complete mental breakdown, becoming completely unresponsive and unable to even speak. Chaos would ensue, with riots spreading throughout England. With the country left on the edge of collapse and no one to lead, a regency council was created, and despite furious protests from Margaret of Anjou, Richard of York was still the premier duke of the realm. He was appointed Lord Protector, with his 11-year-old son Edward by his side. For the next 2 years, Richard would implement reforms and attempt to lead the country away from civil war. But Richard's quick rise to power was seen as a threat by many families that benefited from Lancaster rule. This resulted in a domino effect, where England's premier noble families began to divide along this York-Lancaster line. By 1455, King Henry had finally recovered his mental health, and he relieved Richard of York of his post as Lord Protector. But by this point, enough of the nobility, including Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, commander of the largest standing army in England, had sided with the York cause. The nobility would no longer accept King Henry VI's rule. With their support, Richard of York gathered an army to confront King Henry. On May 22, 1455, 5,000 men flying the White Rose of York met 2,000 flying the Red Rose of the Lancasters at the First Battle of St. Albans. The ensuing battle would end as a decisive York victory, resulting in the death of many of Richard of York's worst enemies and the capture of King Henry VI. Although none of them knew it then, this small battle would begin a 30-year civil war that would end with the death of every Lancaster and every York heir. King Henry VI would soon be released, but only after agreeing to reappoint York as Lord Protector of England. York now had the king under his thumb, and the nobles who supported him began to fly up the English ranks. The Earl of Warwick especially, who had allowed Richard to fight in the first place, became Richard's right-hand man and one of the richest men in the country. But behind the scenes, Margaret of Anjou was furious that her husband, and more importantly, she, was out of power. She and Henry now had a son and heir, Edward of Westminster, and now more than ever, Richard of York was a threat that had to be dealt with. Over the years, Margaret of Anjou had been secretly amassing a large army of men, which had swelled to the size of 10,000, nearly doubling any army that Richard could raise. Less than a year after agreeing to reappoint York as Lord Protector, King Henry VI once again relieved York of his title. Before Richard could even rally his troops, Margaret had given the signal for her new army to ambush 5,000 York soldiers. Warwick's forces would be defeated soon after. Knowing that Margaret was out for blood, Richard and Warwick were forced to flee England immediately. Richard would go to Ireland, while Warwick took Richard's eldest son Edward, the Earl of March, to France. Edward, now 17 and tall and strong, had grown up beside his father during his rise to power, and was now seen as a political leader in his own right. He would be named by the Lancasters, alongside his father Richard and Warwick, as traitors. Their lives were now forfeit, along with all of their lands and money. With nothing left to lose, Richard knew that there was only one option left on the table: invade England and take the throne by force. It would take a full year, but Warwick and Edward were able to amass a force of nearly 10,000 men to finally fight back against Margaret and the Lancasters. They would invade England and land on June 26, 1460. Once they landed, it was clear that the people of England were already on their side. Warwick and Edward were basically able to march all the way to London unopposed. When Edward and Warwick finally caught up to the Lancasters at the Battle of Northampton, they crushed them. One of the Lancaster commanders even switched to the York side in the middle of the battle and allowed Warwick and his men directly into the camp, where King Henry VI was staying. He would be a hostage of the Yorks once again. In custody, Henry was ready to agree to any York demands. But this time, Richard of York would not be satisfied with just anything. He was coming for the crown. In October of 1460, the Act of Accord was passed, which stated that following King Henry's death, the throne would pass to Richard. The York family had turned their fortunes around in just one generation, from nearly being destroyed by King Henry V to placing themselves on the English throne. Edward was now second in line behind his father, and was sure to become King of England himself one day. It was now too dangerous for them to be together. Now 18 years old, Edward was given command of his own army. He was sent to Wales to put down opposition to the York claim, while his father Richard and younger brother Edmund would remain in London. Margaret of Anjou would flee north to Scotland, and to no one's surprise, she had a plan. In Scotland, Margaret was able to negotiate both French and Scottish support against the Yorks. When news reached Richard that Margaret had raised an army, he immediately left to contain the threat, hoping to finally defeat her once and for all. In December of 1460, Margaret's force came head-to-head with Richard's at a main York castle near Wakefield. Stepping out into the cold, York would have immediately seen that Margaret's forces outnumbered him nearly 2-1. Whether it was impatience or hubris, Richard still believed that they could win. But at the Battle of Wakefield, the Yorkists suffered a catastrophic loss. Richard of York, along with his son, Edmund, were killed. Edward, just 18, had only recently been given his first command ever. He was now the 4th Duke of York, patriarch of his family, and the heir apparent to the English throne. It was now up to him to finish what his father had started and avenge the deaths of his family. Edward would march south and decisively defeat Henry VI's stepfather Owen Tudor at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. It would turn out to not just be a physical defeat, but a symbolic one as well. As dawn broke on the field, what we now know to be a meteorological phenomenon called parhelion occurred, giving the appearance of a trio of suns rising over the battlefield. Edward used the moment to convince his troops that this was a sign, the Holy Trinity, evidence that he was chosen by God to be king. Although Margaret would defeat Warwick at the Second Battle of St. Albans, and King Henry VI was returned to the Lancaster troops, the Lancasters remained incredibly unpopular with the people of England. When they marched to take back London, they were denied entry. Edward wisely used this moment to reunite with Warwick and march on London himself. The two were not denied entry and were instead met with crowds of people who saw this tall and imposing figure as the physical and metaphorical opposite of King Henry's mental and bodily frailty. He would be crowned King Edward IV, King of England, on March 4th, 1461. But Edward knew that the true crown of England could only be won on the battlefield by defeating Margaret of Anjou. The combined armies of Edward and Warwick were finally ready to face the Red Queen. On March 29, 1461, 60,000 men faced each other, more than half of them flying the Red Rose of the Lancasters, and the other half flying the White Rose of the Yorks. Before the battle, both sides had agreed that no quarter would be given to the losing side. The Battle of Towton would end up the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. As the battle began, so did a howling blizzard. Heavy wind caused arrows to be ineffective, making hand-to-hand combat the only way to fight. King Edward IV and his men clashed with the Lancasters and fought off wave after wave. But after hours of fighting, the Lancasters began to push them back. The York men began to panic, realizing they were fighting for their very lives. As the York army's left flank began to fall into disarray, it was King Edward who took command, saving them from being overtaken. But they knew they couldn't last long. It was now only a matter of time. But just as it began to look hopeless, a fresh York force crested over the battlefield and rammed into the Lancaster flank. Delayed by the snow, the Norfolks had nearly missed the entire battle. To the exhausted Lancaster forces, the battle quickly turned into a nightmare. Men began to flee, taking off their armor just to run faster, which only made them more vulnerable. In the end, the fighting lasted 10 hours, and nearly 20,000 men would die on that snowy field. The White Rose of the Yorks won that day, but the rivers surrounding the battlefield ran Lancaster red for several days after. With their force decimated, King Henry VI and Margaret were forced to flee. Yet before he left England, he made sure to alienate himself by calling many of his allies who had just fought and died for him traitors. King Edward would go on to pardon many of the nobles that had fought against him, and helping solidify his claim as king. He had won his crown, avenged his father, and ended King Henry VI's reign. For his part, the Earl of Warwick, who had been instrumental in helping the young Edward become king, became the most powerful noble in England, maybe even more powerful than the king himself. He would become known as the Kingmaker. Warwick began to attempt negotiations with France, knowing that France would now be Edward's biggest challenge to overcome. It would take 3 years before they accepted, and nearly a year of Warwick's active negotiations after that before the two countries finally agreed to peace. The agreement proposed that Edward would marry Anne of France, the daughter of the French King Louis XI. There was just one issue. Edward IV was already married. Earlier that year, Edward had met a woman named Elizabeth Woodville and was absolutely entranced by her. Claimed by contemporaries to be the most beautiful woman on the island of Britain, she and Edward would secretly marry soon after, to the shock and rage of many of Edward's advisors, and especially Warwick. Embarrassed and betrayed, Warwick couldn't believe Edward's impulsive stupidity. France was now offended, and worst of all, now everyone knew that Edward was his own man, and not under the thumb of Warwick, which reduced Warwick's influence greatly. The two men's relationship would never recover from this, and over the years it just got worse. But anytime anyone brought up concerns about Warwick's loyalty, Edward dismissed them. This was the man who had practically raised him, and fought tirelessly not only for him, but for his father as well. He wouldn't betray him. Unbeknownst to Edward, by 1467, Warwick was plotting, actively seeking someone who could replace Edward. He looked no further than Edward's younger brothers. Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, was incredibly loyal to Edward, so he wouldn't do. But George, the Duke of Clarence, was very much like Edward. Although George had always supported his brother's claim to the throne, he had also always been jealous of Edward, and his personal ambition made it so that he could not refuse an offer to become king. George and Warwick would betray Edward. In 1469, when under the guise of a rebellion in the north, the two men would go to France to negotiate support from the French for George and for their coup. But the negotiations did not go as Warwick had planned. Louis XI not only refused George as Edward's replacement, he offered to help only if Henry VI was reinstated as king, and only if Warwick would ally with none other than Margaret of Anjou. When news reached Warwick that Edward had discovered his betrayal, he was forced to agree to all terms. Warwick had not just betrayed the York line, but every man who had ever fought for him, all in the pursuit of more power. In order to cement the alliance and to test George's loyalty to his brother, Margaret and King Louis of France told Warwick to invade England first, before they would be willing to join him. On September 13, 1470, George and Warwick invaded England. Staging an uprising in the north and attacking separately, they scattered the king's army and quickly surrounded London and the king. With no other options, King Edward was forced to flee. He took with him his younger brother Richard, the only man he felt he could trust. Less than a month later, the old King Henry VI was back on the throne of England once again, and just as Warwick had wanted, he was now indisputably the power behind the English throne. But what Warwick didn't foresee was that everyone around Henry VI hated him for good reason. He had killed most of their fathers or brothers, and had even betrayed George by not giving him the throne he promised. That hatred would cause internal disputes that would eventually leave Warwick completely isolated. Meanwhile, Edward IV was not gone from England for long. He was still supported by much of the nobility who had fought and won for him, and soon enough he had gathered an army of his own. Edward would invade England and quickly take back London. With his older brother back in power, George begged for forgiveness, and Edward graciously gave it to him. With George gone and Margaret's forces still in France, Warwick was left truly alone. But he was still powerful in his own right, and he believed he had the upper hand on Edward. He would hold Edward off on his own and crush him when Margaret's forces finally arrived. But what Warwick didn't know is that a storm was keeping Margaret's troops in France, and they had not even left. On the foggy morning of April 14, 1471, Edward and Warwick met as enemies for the first time. Whether it was the battle against his old allies or his anger that Margaret hadn't shown up, Warwick was clearly on edge, and his patience for the battle to begin quickly ran out. He would send out his men before the fog had even cleared and end this once and for all. This would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. In the fog, his men ended up attacking each other, and coupled with Edward's real attack, it quickly turned into a massacre. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, was struck off his horse and killed in the fray. Margaret would arrive in England the same day that Warwick died, and upon the news of his death, she almost left England. But her son, now 17, convinced her to fight. Her army would march through extremely hot weather for nearly a month, causing severe fatigue in her men before she and Edward could finally face each other on May 4th, 1471. After a month of marching and years of lead-up, the actual battle was over quickly and decisively, with Edward's forces destroying Margaret's tired men easily. Margaret's only son, Edward, the Prince of Wales, was killed in the battle by George, the Duke of Clarence. And Margaret, who was inconsolable over the death of her son, was taken prisoner. At last, the Lancaster army was truly defeated. There was only one thing left to do. On May 21st, 1471, King Edward IV's victorious army re-entered London, and he was proclaimed King Edward IV of England once again. That very same day, Henry VI would die mysteriously as a prisoner in the Tower of London. The royal house of Lancaster died with him. The Yorks would finally rule England, but Edward's peace would be short-lived. King Edward IV's brothers, George and Richard's relationships had begun to sour. The two had always been very different from each other. Richard had been extremely loyal to Edward, and was now one of his most trusted advisors. George had been forgiven for his betrayal, but was still jealous of the trust Edward put into Richard. He would act out in the coming years, even taking the law into his own hands, murdering one of his wife's servants after his wife died unexpectedly. George's attitude that he was above the law was infuriating to Edward. Edward soon learned that George had been spreading rumors that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was illegitimate, and it was the final straw. He would arrest and personally prosecute his brother, stating that he was unnatural, loathy, and treasonous. Over the years and years of conflict, Edward's only natural allies had been his own family, and George had betrayed even that basic level of trust. George was privately executed on the 18th of February, 1478. It was only after this harrowing time that King Edward would finally find peace. After nearly a century of war dominating England, Edward had come out the victor. He would spend the rest of his life relishing in that victory. Edward and Elizabeth would go on to have 10 children, with 2 boys to continue the York line. On April 9th, 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly at just 40 years old, after years of hard partying and excess. In his will, he entrusted the rule of his land to his brother Richard, who would become Lord Protector until his son was able to rule. But Richard, who had always been loyal to Edward, had other plans for the boys and for the crown of England. Our next episode will cover Richard III and the princes in the Tower. So, what did Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville really look like? Currently, there are no contemporary portraits of either Edward or Elizabeth, so what we are left with are copies made from originals. We do have some pretty good descriptions of them both, which I'll be using to inform my recreations alongside the portraits. Let's start with Edward. We know that he was a very tall man. Edward's remains were exhumed in 1789, and they measured almost 6'4", which was gigantic for this time. This examination also revealed some long brown hair, which matches his portraits. Edward was considered extremely handsome in his youth, although it was remarked upon that his looks faded quickly because of his hard partying lifestyle. Sir Thomas More says that Edward was of body mighty, but in his latter days with over-liberal diet, somewhat corpulent and burly, but nevertheless not uncomely. Regardless of his looks, Edward was always considered likable and charismatic. As we know from the history, this really worked to his political advantage because King Henry VI was seen as so weak. These were the kings that actually fought and won their crowns in battle, so Edward's height and strength were huge advantages. For Edward's recreation, I'm going to use this portrait, which is generally agreed upon to be the most accurate and shows him in his early 30s. Now, let's move on to Elizabeth Woodville. As I said, no contemporary portraits of Elizabeth exist outside of some stained glass images and some manuscript illustrations. In this famous portrait, of which there are several versions with slightly different features, we see her blonde hair peeking out from the headdress and beautiful light brown eyes. Some historians even believe she may have had light gray or even light green eyes, which have darkened with the varnish on this image. Now, Elizabeth's story has been quite romanticized. Obviously, she must have been stunningly beautiful to convince the king to marry her as a woman far below his rank. But based on descriptions from her life, she probably was very beautiful according to the beauty standards of the period. A Burgundian chronicler called Elizabeth the most beautiful woman in England, saying that the king had chosen her because of this very great beauty. There's also a quote that she had heavy-lidded eyes like those of a dragon, which is an amazing description but may not have been written at the time she was alive. What's really cool about this main portrait of Elizabeth is that it shows a collision of fashion trends from all over Europe. She's wearing a style of gown similar to those of the Burgundian court, which was her sister-in-law's residence and one of the most famously influential courts of the time in terms of politics as well as fashion. The style of her gown is referred to as a transitional dress, meaning it bridges the gap between the V-neck Burgundian gowns and the square-necked gowns we see later on the Tudors. Elizabeth is also wearing a variation of the hennin headdress. Hennins were this pretty crazy style of headdress popular during this time. They would use wire to shape a giant veil over the head, and they could take many shapes. We also see a trend all the way from Florence, Italy, which was now booming during the Italian Renaissance. Elizabeth's hairline in this portrait has been plucked or shaved back. So, let's take a look at the faces of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville now. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you for the next video.